Well, thank you for that introduction. Though it does leave me, I guess, in the position of having to provide a brief explanation. And the brief explanation, quite frankly, is that I am not renowned as a sort of staunch and true believer in Donald Trump. But I am in the ranks of those, and I would say it's just because of my permanent disposition. I'm always willing to wait for the evidence and be convinced by it. But I think we have differing opinions, some of us, on how much evidence is going to be required. And I say that just very briefly by way of explaining why my standing at Trump. Oh, I have no problem standing, though, behind a podium that says Donald Trump. He is, after all, the President of the United States, and unlike some people, I believe we ought to respect the President. Regardless of whether we agree, disagree, applaud, worship, whatever we might do, we still need to understand that in respecting the President of the United States, we are in fact showing a respect for our own liberty, which we will lose on the day that we decisively forget that fact. Unhappily, what I'm here to talk about tonight may very well be one of the reasons why it's not amiss to worry about whether we are in fact on that track. Because I think that we are. This country waxed great and strong. Against, by the way, the expectations, I think, of the world that first greeted its birth, and even of some of the founders. Some did entertain visions of great American success, and others thought with great trepidation of the experiment that the nation had embarked upon, mainly because they had taken sides against the overwhelming weight of serious political thought throughout the history of mankind. That's pretty weighty. And they took sides in favor of the possibility of a government in which there would be serious, full, adequate, sovereign participation by the people that would actually have some hope, not only of lasting, survival seems to be what people talk about these days, but of being just and decent and good government. And I think they put a lot of work, not just into standing up for what they thought was just and right, which is what led to the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution in the first place, but they also put a lot of thought into trying to consider carefully why it was that those who would stand historically as the opponents of their effort to establish a democratic constitutional republic, why those arguments from their opponents had weight and had to be taken into consideration. Not as some would suggest, because the founders were in favor of aristocracy, oligarchy, all these things people accuse them of, but actually because they were in favor of a democratic, republican form of government. And they understood that the worst thing you can do to somebody you like is fail to take account of their weaknesses when you are setting them upon a task. Nothing could have been worse for the people of the United States than that our country had been founded by people who were so blinded by their commitment to the role of the people in securing justice that they forgot all the pitfalls that necessarily attend the people's involvement in political life. The most important one, of course, and the most obvious, I think, in some ways, is that the people are, like the nation and justice and other things, a bit of an abstraction. Every people is a bit of an abstraction because we don't encounter the people. We encounter people as individuals. We meet them one at a time. And the fate of the people overall is very much decided by what those people do and what they are like and what they understand themselves to be. To come to conclusions about that requires things that not everybody has in the same degree, in terms of the ability patiently to consider both evidence and experience in order to reach a conclusion about whether something that's standing in front of you is one or many. And of course, you're especially challenged about that when you're dealing with a concept like people, which requires that, as our coins have said, you are standing on the ground that it is possible that you should make of many one in the decisive respect of establishing a regime based upon their will that will then determine the course of a society in respect of right and wrong, justice and injustice, survival and perishing. And this was the choice they made. Now, the reason that I say that that choice is imperiled is because, and I want to try this evening, by the way, I'm trying to be, I set myself a task of being, this is going to be more like a lecture than my usual speech. Because I think we live in a time when it's altogether too easy to take folks who are predisposed to be patriotic about this country and make them feel good about that patriotism. Predisposed to be angry with folks who don't show proper respect for all the good things that America represents, and therefore not study as the founders had to study all the flaws and faults that must inevitably arise in any system of government that ceases to base the prudential decisions of every day on the larger decisions of justice and injustice on anything that approximates the will of the people. In order to understand why they took that chance, why they took that risk, I think we have to go and look at the founding, and we have to look at it in terms that unfortunately are not usually considered anymore, particularly by politicians who are in the thick of things in our politics as well. It has greatly dismayed me because it's possibly the major difference between the world in which I grew up and was attracted into participation in our politics and the world we now live in. Our politicians, and I think we actually, I won't go into great detail, see examples of it all the time, including today. The other day I was considering an example of this phenomenon I'm about to speak of in an article I was reading, in which someone was purporting to talk about the founders' admiration for aristocracy, and how this was not about being elitists and so forth and so on, but was in fact done in the best interest of sustaining the constitutional experiment they knew they were embarking on. And in that respect, in that logic, the article was entirely correct. And he went through, and of course, at some point, the author has to talk about the Declaration of Independence and its influence on the understanding of government that was involved in putting together and framing and coming up with the provisions of the Constitution. And I read through the article, and I nodded. Its reasoning was good in this respect and that respect, and I got to the end. And as unfortunately all too often happens to me, I found myself not thinking about what I had just read, but about what I didn't read. Isn't that funny? I used to have a teacher who talked about arguments from silence. And I think I have two reasons to take that seriously. First of all, because I think God makes some of his best arguments from silence. And I also think that's why we don't often pay attention, because we're talking too much to listen. And at the same time, I think that it's critical because it indicates that you're looking for something that ought to be there. And unbeknownst to you, your mind is looking for it, and when you don't hear it, you miss it. And the first experience I had of this in concrete terms, that it wasn't just an accident when it happened, occurred when I was actually visiting the hall in Philadelphia where the Declaration of Independence was drafted and signed, and everybody went through it in Independence Hall. And there was the guide, and this was, my children were still quite young then, only had 2 of them at that point, I think. And I had taken them to Independence Hall. This was going to be, a time when they would have their daddy, who actually knows a little something about that, talking to them about this. But of course, we took the usual tour, partly because I wanted to see what they'd be saying. And when we got to the question of the Declaration of Independence, the guide quoted the Declaration. He said, well, the Declaration tells us today, as it did then, that we are all equal. And of course, my mind went, no, that's not what the Declaration says. The Declaration doesn't say that. What does the Declaration say? We're all created equal. And I went up to the guy afterwards and said, well, did they give you the script, or did you just say that because that's how you feel? Because that's not what the Declaration says. And he says, well, we are, subject to certain things that we have to talk about, but yes, the words were mine and my way of putting it, and so forth and so on. And I looked at him and said, well, you do know that the Declaration does not say we're all equal. It says we're all created equal, since the statement that we're all equal would be an absurdity. You and I both know that there's almost no respect of any importance that we can see, that we can understand in our tangible and material experience, in which we reach the conclusion that people are equal. Some people run faster than others, think better than others, sing better than others, cook better than others, are sharper in their apprehension of all different kinds of things. There's almost nothing human beings do in which there would be any empirical data to support the notion that we're all of us equal. No. But when you say created equal, you are thankfully not looking at things from the perspective and vantage point of our limited and circumscribed humanity. You're looking at them from the vantage point of the Creator. And who is the Creator? Well, actually, it's mentioned in the Declaration when it speaks of the laws of nature and of nature's God. The one who created us, the one who made the heaven and the earth, the one who set the stars in place and raised up the mountains and created all the creatures and the wonderful vast creatures of the deep and so forth. Creation, taken for granted as the fundamental and starting premise of the Declaration's discussion of the great crisis that led them to take up arms in defense of their understanding of liberty. And I notice it all the time, though, because this gentleman went through, he talked about it, and he never, ever mentioned the full words of the Declaration. Never, therefore, dealt with the underlying and most important contributing factor to the crisis of our constitutional self-government. And that is that we came into existence as the result of an appeal to the authority of God. And in the course of my lifetime, our politicians, our leaders, our most influential people in every walk of life, at least they claim to be, have turned their backs in one way or another, to some degree or another, on that premise of God, of God's authority, and of God's creation. And I stand back and there are all kinds of reasons why they're doing that, and I'll get into some of them. But I think the real question isn't why they're doing it. Because I think that question can be easily understood in terms of a brief, and I think reasonably accurate observation, that the United States of America represented certainly the longest lived, but actually the most thoroughly thought through and sincerely intended, rather than merely fortuitous or accidental implementation of the idea of government by the people as a whole, of any nation in the history of humankind. And what did that mean? Well, I know what it meant to some people, and you can see symptoms of it all the time. I mean, if you're one of those people who happens to be really good at something that's really important to people, like keeping them alive when they're being attacked by nasty folks, the war, keeping them alive when they're being attacked by all kinds of nasty diseases, one of those useful things that knowledge can sometimes lead to, right, of herbs and potions and things like this. Well, you end up in most societies with an awful lot of power. A matter of fact, in ancient times, it was quite possible that you would end up being worshipped as God. He's a God. You can't say anything against his will. You can't do it. We go to the temple and we worship him. That comes up in the scripture with Jesus and Caesar. And they built temples to folks who were in that position. And you and I both know. And I can think of several people that come to mind. You can be all kinds of wealthy and powerful in the United States of America. You can have all kinds of things that everybody wants and covets in the way of material goods and experiences and so forth and so on. What experience do you never have? You never have the experience of visiting a temple dedicated to the great God, you. And we might forget, but that was the epitome, the cynosure of human ambition. It was the cynosure of human ambition that is, as we know, a descendant of the question that got us into all this trouble in the first place. Is there anything in the garden God told you not to eat? Well, he knows not to eat that of that tree over there, and so forth and so on, because he said that if we ate it, that we would surely die. Although if you eat that, then ye shall be as God. See? Knowing good from evil. That is the very epitome of the human temptation that is at the heart of all unbridled and licentious ambition. And why should we think that people born into our society will be immune to it? Now, you could think that at first because they were born into a society that was regarded by the great powers of the rest of the world as kind of a backwater. I remember pointing out in my dissertation that was thought to be so true that there was one author taken to task in America, of course, for saying that in the New World, even the dogs forget how to bark. That's how savage and wild it is. But at the end of the day, thankfully, we had founders who had a little better vision. And they saw the possibility that with the great and vast potential, even of the land that, say, a George Washington could survey at the time, in Western Virginia and other places, they could see the potential. This was going to be a wealthy and potentially powerful nation such as no one had ever seen before. I marvel at the way they foresaw that kind of possibility. But they also foresaw what it would do to ambition. That where you might think in this backwater place there are not going to be any great and vaulting ambitions like the one that led Macbeth to kill King Duncan, it turns out that the United States was headed down a path that very shortly into its life started to open up prospects that fed the most powerful ambitions. The ambition to rule, the ambition to reign, the ambition to be the unrivaled dictator and master of all that you survey. How on earth would a democratic Republican Constitution survive such ambition? Well, sadly, in this world of multi-billionaires being created by the wonderful advances of a science truly understood only by a handful, the notion of oligarchic rule is coming into its own again. And ambition is determined to crush out the understanding that led the people to presume that they had any claim to sovereign power. Well, don't you think if we're really serious about trying to help restore the way of life that was based upon that presumptuous idea, don't you think we better go back and consider what it was that led the founders to think it was possible for Americans to make it work? I think we should. I think we ought to think that through. Because ambition has proven throughout the history of mankind to be the ultimate victor over every society that has ever existed. No one has ever survived the vaulting ambition of those who are equipped with the talent to subdue others to their will. By force, by guile, by reason, and miracles worked as a result of their understanding. They've always done it. And believe me, they will do it again. They are doing it now. And one of the things that helps us to understand what they're doing, we can even see. I remember talking a while back about a commercial that was commonly on the air then. I forget who was being advertised, but it showed you a picture of people coming out in the early morning, and they were all lining up and taking a rope and so forth and so on. And they were tugging on this rope, right? And by the time you got through the commercial, a commercial for this or that company, I don't know what it was, what had they done? they had by pulling and tugging on that rope caused the sun to rise. And I said to myself, that reminded me of that commercial where they talk about and she shots at people at the end of the day in their management positions, leaving the office and so forth and so on. And they say it as the tagline, "These are the kings and queens of America." Deeply offended me, that commercial. I resolved I'd never have anything to do with that company. See? But that's the way thought is going these days. We're not rediscovering aristocracy in any good sense of the term, but we sure are rediscovering the ambition that fueled and fed it. And that ambition is transforming the reality of our politics in a way that must ultimately overthrow its decency and remove those elements which most contributed not so much just to its success as to the extraordinary decency and virtue that continued to be made manifest in the American people in spite of that success. And I think a lot of us worry about that. And a lot of the people in this room know what I'm about to say because it's perfectly obvious. So that's why it is in a way called self-evident. What I'm about to say is self-evident. And you and I know where I'm going with this. We started out as a nation appealing to God. And we end up now as a nation appealing only to power and will. And I saw it proven at the end of this article after going through the aristocracy and how it was good for this and good for that, shouldn't be against this and that, and what in America is going to be the guarantee that our constitutional system will work. We, the people. That's the authority that's going to do it. That's the will that's going to do it. No, it's not. No, it's not. That's a kind of reasoning that isn't even circular, because it starts out in a place and then doesn't go anywhere else. The simple fact of the matter is that the will of just old any people is not going to do anything but betray them into the same manipulation and ultimately the same domination and oppression into which it betrayed people all over the world throughout the history of mankind. The predominant forms of government have always been dictatorial, despotic, and oligarchical, limited only by the whims and predilections of the individuals in power, never by the sense of systematic justice that was required, that had to be respected, even toward those who were ultimately your inferiors and had no right to expect that you would treat them justly. The change that was made possible in America was made possible because though we established a regime in which elections would turn on the choice of the people, we did not establish and did not have established a constitution that regarded the will of the people as the ultimate resource, the ultimate and primordial place where the understanding of right is shaped, from which it arises and begins. For as the Declaration says, we are not equal, but we are created equal by the will, the hand, and in the eyes of God. And then I said to myself, well, you have to ask yourself, what is that about, though, really? Because it doesn't seem to be, as we just were discussing, an empirically verifiable thing. What does it mean? Well, I don't think it's an accident that right after that statement is made, behold, these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. The next statement says, and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And I don't think, by the way, that the language that we associate now with wills and testaments and bequests and all of this, I don't think that was an accident. See? Because in point of fact, that was a commonplace way of discussing things, especially in the aristocracy that prevailed in England, where when you had a certain title, there were certain things with which that title was endowed. Certain powers and authorities, certain land, certain what? What's the final thing I left out? Land, power, what am I leaving out? There were certain duties. There were certain obligations. There were certain responsibilities. And those responsibilities tied you to defend and uphold and contribute to the good of the monarchy, whatever it might be, or the good of the country, the nation. Well, why have we forgotten that when we use the word right now? I mean, I read all of these things and everybody does it. Right, left, center. People will use the word right as if you can just say right and freedom in the same breath and they mean the same thing. You do realize how silly that is. We should step back and realize that that can't possibly be true. Because when I say right to you, what do you immediately think of as the opposite of right? Wrong. You don't think slavery. You don't think imprisonment. Why? Because sometimes it can be right to imprison folks. See? And even if you have the power, it will always be wrong to enslave them innocent of any wrongdoing. So that word right means what it says. He endows every human being with an unalienable rights. Unalienable, by the way, meaning something that you can't give up, surrender, be separated from. Well, the first question we should ask ourselves is, why not? Why can't you be separated from this particular right? Well, if it's a form of right doing rather than wrongdoing, it becomes easy to find out. As a matter of fact, we can come up with very everyday examples of why rights are unalienable. Yeah, but then it's going to lead us to a conclusion that looks very different from our understanding of right. So you're hungry. And time passes, and you're getting hungrier and hungrier. A day passes, 2 days pass, almost 3 days pass. What should you do? What should you do? Eat something. Why? Because otherwise you will die. You will cease to exist. So it's right for you to eat. It's right for you to do what by your nature is prescribed so that you can continue to exist. What does that mean? Well, you relate it to the sentence we just went through, are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and you realize, wait a minute, they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights means certain unalienable inclinations to do what is right. I raise the issue of eating because that's one of the most obvious ways in which God has endowed us with inclinations that serve right doing in respect of His will for our existence. Isn't that true? And we know other things, hunger, thirst, and even the passions that in other respects can be all controversial and everything and so forth and so on. But at one level, in the state we are now in, when you see a beautiful woman and those desires start to rise within you, in just a general sense, is that right or wrong? It's right. Why? Because it's essential to the perpetuation of humanity. That's why. Because you are programmed to do what is necessary so that the human race can continue to exist as God wills it to do. Well, what then turns out to be crucial to this whole understanding of right? What God wills. That turns out to be crucial. Rights are not just freedoms. Rights involve an exercise of freedom to do what? To do what is right according to God's provision. And I love that word provision in this context because it has a double meaning. One meaning that springs to mind, especially in the context of the Declaration, the Constitution, all this, provisions of law. The other word that should spring to mind, however, is, well, what provisions do we have for this trip? That's why I keep harping on the eating, see? Because it reminds us that in point of fact, rights are not ultimately rooted in freedom. Rights are ultimately rooted in obligation. What we are obliged to do in order to fulfill the will of God for our existence. That's why the juxtaposition between creation and right. Now, what sometimes just has me standing back in awe at the extent to which human beings can blind themselves to their own situation is that if this were 300 or 400 years ago and folks would maybe have some questions about this understanding of right, I could see it because people had a hard time thinking about the possibility that an intelligent being could actually do something that would, at a distance, lead other objects or beings to operate according to the expected result that that being intended to achieve. See? They would have a hard time. We do it all the time now, don't we? A matter of fact, every object that we now use pretty much to communicate with each other depends on a concept of programming that is about that very thing. And what is a computer program? It's a set of provisions for the regular behavior of electrons. To be quite frank about it, it's like an irrigation system, making sure that things will flow in this way and that in response to certain things that are done. Making provision for certain actions that will then produce certain results. And those results are what produce the operation of the program. And it turns out that even when we look at ourselves, what are they more and more concluding about our body? That our body is a complex communication system in which communication then leads to transformation, leads certain things that were apart to come together in order to form new possibilities that join with other things to form even newer possibilities until you get organic developments. And those organic developments take place in terms of a destiny or purpose that is then going to produce a liver, a heart, or other organs that are needed to sustain our body. Suddenly, you have to look at that word right, you have to look at the word provision, you even have to look at the word law and realize that when we use the word right, we are not in the first instance referring to free choice. And I know that may go against the grain for some folks. They always like to talk about America's all about freedom and so forth. So no, we're not talking all about any different kind of freedom. It is put in the context of God's creation because we are talking about the fact that we are freely given an existence that depends upon determinations of being made by another for our good. And that first good is that we exist at all. And the second good is that that existence is set up in such a way as to look at the world around it and find in that world the means to provide for itself. And then it's done in such a way as to perpetuate the existence of beings like the being we have in front of us, so that not only is the individual served, but humanity is served by the same provision of God. But it's all rooted not in freedom, what we are free to do, but what we are obliged to do. And whether or not we exercise our freedom in such a way as to accept the gift of life that God intended for us from the beginning. And so ultimately then the Declaration is not just a statement about freedom. It is a statement from people who have determined to do what? to come together and to establish a community that will reflect their common commitment to do what is right according to the will of the Creator. And that commitment to do what is right according to God is then what gives rise to their rights. It answers a question, by the way, that I got many years ago when I was campaigning in '96 in New Hampshire, and campaigning for president. And a young lady came up to me and she said, well, you're always talking about rights. Why do you always talk about rights? And I said, well, the Declaration talks about them. And she said, well, I still don't understand. And I said, well, where do your rights come from? And she paused for a minute and gave the answer I would have expected from somebody in liberal Massachusetts going to a boarding school or whatever she was, one of those schools, the British would call them public schools, I suppose, that educate our elites. She said, well, I told us that our rights come from the Constitution. And I looked back at her and I said, well, wait a minute. Before the Constitution was written, when folks were sitting down to deliberate what should be in the Constitution, how did they know what rights to put in there? See, the Constitution hadn't been written yet. How can you say your rights come from the Constitution when the people who enumerated rights in the Constitution had to recognize them? They must have been there already. Yes? It makes perfect sense. So how do you recognize a right? Another story that might help you to reach the conclusion that's pretty obvious. I remember talking to a high school class years ago and got into the issues of the Declaration and so forth, and somebody asked me a question about what I meant by this meaning of right. And I said, well, let's say you're walking down the hall and the bell rings and you encounter a teacher. Everybody's scrambling to get to class, and this your homeroom teacher, whatever, knows where you're supposed to be that hour of the day, and you're walking in the opposite direction. But you've just come from the gym. And the principal had something else to do, but he wanted you to carry a message to another teacher that he didn't have the time to tend to. And he said, would you go tell so-and-so such and such? And you were walking to that person's class. You knew where it was because you took a course from them. And it happened to be in the opposite direction from the class you had to go to. So when the teacher stops you to question why you're walking away from class instead of toward the class you should be going to, you look at her and say, well, the principal told me to do it. Okay? That's the definition of right. Right is doing what you are authorized to do by the guy in charge, or gal, as that case may be. Isn't that exactly what the Declaration says? The Declaration asserts that we are endowed by our Creator, which means, if we understand it correctly, commissioned by the provisions of our Creator. That's why the reference is made to the laws of nature and nature's God. Because our nature is a creation of God, and what sustains it are the provisions of God, which are as a law for our survival, for our existence, for our good. And with that understanding, you realize you can recognize what is a right by asking yourself, what are the commandments of God? And some of them tell you what the boundaries are, and others tell you what you ought to do. But either way, when you are committed to do as the sovereign of all tells you to do, as you go about your business, is there any human authority that can tell you not to do the bidding of the highest authority there is? No, there is not. You act by commission of the highest authority, and therefore no authority is authorized to interfere with what you do. Did you ever wonder why it is that governments are supposed to respect and secure rights? Because those rights represent the commands of an authority higher than any human authority. And therefore, when people are going about their business doing as God requires them to do, anyone who interferes with them is not going against them. They are going against God Almighty. I know that that's exactly the understanding that the founders proclaimed in justifying the American Revolution. How have we forgotten this simple logic? And I think we have forgotten it. I think people on all sides of the spectrum have forgotten that the word right is rooted in the authority of God. Deny the authority of God, and there is in this country no claim to right. And as liberty is included among the rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit. What is liberty? Liberty is not just the freedom to do what you choose and the freedom to do what you want and so forth and so on. We have a common liberty, don't we? It is the liberty that results in the Constitution, the liberty that produces our elections, the liberty that sanctions the self-government of, by, and for the people. But sanctions that self-government not as an opportunity to do what you please, but as a responsibility to do what is right by God, according to his provisions for humanity, individually, and on the whole. Now, if you think that through, the doctrine of rights doesn't become what we've made of it. A temptation to assert, I got the freedom to do this. You can't interfere with my freedom to do that. I have the freedom to do anything I want. If I want to be a man and God made me a woman, I have the freedom to be a man. I don't care what the chromosomes say. See? Does that make sense? No, of course it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense according to reason. But what is reason? Reason is our apprehension according to the rule of God, yes, of what is or is not consistent with itself and therefore with its own existence. And so at the end of the day, we look at it all and we say, whoa, wait a minute. All this time we've been talking about how it's all about individual freedom. I'm sorry, all the Declaration is all about, in the first instance, the individual's responsibility to God. And then it requires something else. It requires, in order to become a basis for government, it requires that a fair number of individuals resolve together that they shall stand in the way of God and not depart from it. That they shall walk in the way of God and not depart from it. That they shall treat one another according to the command of God and not depart from it. Now, Alan, that's just what I read in the Mayflower Compact. That's just what I saw at work in all these different colonies that were established by sects and denominations in America. People who came together and said it right there, a lot of them, in their original statement of what was going to be the basis for governing their colony. They did so standing in the will of God, walking in the way of God, and determined that they should lend their common and mutual support and power to a community that would exist in the service of God's will for humanity and all creation. And they did so, yes, according to things that they had learned from the Bible, but they did so also, not just from the written word, but things reported in that written word about the teaching of the incarnate word. And in that very scripture is affirmed the whole logic I just said, for in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Through the Word all things were made. And we know now, of course, what is a word? A word is not just what we say, obviously. It's not a spoken thing necessarily. Even in the Psalms recognize that. The heavens proclaim the glory of the Lord. Spread, the word of it all over the earth, right? And at the end of the day, word implies an understandable communication. We should understand how word is not just what's written on the page, it's what's behind what's written on the page, the reality, which is a determination of who? What determines the reality? That the words on the page and the words in our mind and the words in our mouth are supposed to represent God Almighty. He has shaped it all, including ourselves. And therefore, we are subject to the determinations of his being. And we are free because we follow and observe those determinations, which have set us free from what is at the end of the day the undifferentiated non-existence of things in the perfect being of God. We are not necessary. We are chosen. Chosen by his will for our existence, by his will for our good, by his determination that we should be in a way that corresponds to his perfect understanding. And this is love. And so at the end of the day, the Declaration of Independence is about God, his authority, and his love, communicated in the provisions that he has made for us and followed once and when we learn to love God. And out of that love to yearn like a dry desert, like a thirsty stream bed for his will, for his commands. For we know that our existence is his will. And we know that our highest good has already been provided for so long as his will be done. Now see, I think that is the understanding, it's the logic, it's the reasoning that underlies the Declaration. The second thing we have to do, though, is ask ourselves, okay, if that's the reasoning, because sometimes these days, and I started out criticizing people who don't even want to use the words in the Declaration. But my main dismay is that they don't want to apply the logic of the Declaration. See, the logic of the Declaration is such that we shouldn't be involved in certain discussions. They should just be considered absurd by everybody. The discussion of whether or not, because you woke up this morning feeling like a woman, even though you're equipped to be a man by God, you have suddenly become a woman, is an absurd discussion. It's a discussion that, thankfully, throughout most of the history of humankind, would have been greeted with gales of laughter. And behavior according to those words would have been greeted with, at the very least, a certain amount of contempt, and at the very most, with much harsher reactions, as we very well know. Why? Is it just because folks throughout the history of the world just hated on people? They couldn't stand diversity and so forth and so on. I got to tell you, y'all, I have spent a fair amount of my life, first as a matter of study and then as a matter of choice, because I got interested in it, reading about ancient history. And I'll be frank with you, I think the ancient world was way more diverse than ours. For various reasons, a lot of us, were born into a world in which human knowledge had already started to smooth out a lot of the things that constituted the basis for sharp distinctions among nations, among people, and so forth and so on. Technology has a way of doing that. And apprehension about Babel may be in order for this time. Why? Because, in fact, we have these machines. And what do they communicate according to? At the end of the day, that's why they can be hacked and stuff, They speak the same language. And if they speak the same language, the people who put them together are communicating using the same language. So if you think we're in danger of having God look down and say, whoa, I better do something about that, I think you might be right. He's done it before. But I think it hardly depends, as it's even indicated in that passage. It kind of depends on what you're going to do with this. Are you going to puff yourself up and ascribe to yourself, we're going to make our name will be known and worshiped and glorified everywhere? Well, the heavens proclaim the glory of the Lord so that the name of the Lord can be worshiped and exalted and praised everywhere. You want your name put in the place of God's name, and your sin is in unity. Your sin is the deepest, darkest rebellion against the possibility of your own existence. A more emphatic madness and wickedness against your very being, I can barely imagine. And yet, this is where we are. And in terms of the United States, we're here, y'all, because for some reason I do not comprehend. I really don't. People, and I know because I have spent a fair amount of time in the course of my political life, because it turned out that things I had been led with God's help, I pray and hope to conclude, appealed to a lot of believers, all different denominations and so forth and so on. I think that's because in spite of differences we may have about what the words are telling us, we know what the word is telling us. We know it because that word is not a matter of mind only. It's a matter of heart. And the desire of our heart is not written in our ambition. It's written, rather, in the intention of God for us and all creation. And the people who understand that, we work from a common heart. We stand in a common place. And meaning no offense to all these people who have forgotten it, that was the common place, the community that was and defined and lifted up and strengthened and allowed for the unified action, defense, and prosperity of the people of the United States. That willingness to stand on the common ground of God's will. Fighting over it sometimes, to be sure, but I got to tell you, fighting over what God wants you to do is a far cry better than fighting against what he wants you to do. He understands the heart that yearns to do his will. He will forgive that heart if it is mistaken but sincere in its will to honor him. But rebellion, the hubristic assumption that we shall stand on our own, that our knowledge now surpasses the knowledge of God, and if it doesn't, what he knows doesn't matter anyway. You realize that's where we're standing now. So much of our elites overtaken by this sickness. Oh, it's why when they meddle in the affairs of the people, the folks who believe this way always end up telling people they ought to go out and show their pride. Black pride and gay pride and Hispanic pride and Mexican pride. Doesn't that bother people who go to church every Sunday? And read that pride goeth before a fall? And read that the Lord is storing up his wrath against the prideful. We go into the streets and celebrate that which has come to us, our color, our circumstances, by the hand of God, with the will of God. And yet we pretend that that's somehow consistent with the logic of a society in which our participation as citizens in the governance of our country is based on respect for God's will. This is in some ways so obvious that, as I say, I find it hard to believe we've let it come this far. But I especially find it hard to believe we let it come this far in a country that is still, especially when compared to Europe and some other places in the world, that still has Christians all over the place. And they can try to talk you into it if you want to believe them. That I think that the only thing that keeps Christian people from continually influencing and constituting the majority in this country is that we have now talked ourselves out of it. Somebody came along and they said, tolerance, got to believe in tolerance. Tolerance carried to the point where you tolerate that which implies your non-existence. Well, that's like a person who's handed a glass full of poison and says, well, I don't want to be intolerant, and drinks it off. And there are some things your body can't tolerate, and whether you want to tolerate them or not, they're going to destroy you. There are things that we are welcoming and things that we're applauding and things that we're saying we have to enforce by law. And if we tolerate them, then we shall destroy the very premise of law, the very premise of right, the very capacity for self-government that has not only made this nation possible. That is what opened the gateway and showed us the path, which in some ways was not intentionally taken, to greatness. We need to keep that in mind. It worries me. I gotta confess. It worries me a little bit. It's why, again, I have my reservations about just jumping on the bandwagon, because the slogan bothers me. We're gonna make America great again. Don't you see that a proper understanding of what I've been talking about means that we didn't make America great in the first place? We didn't. America is great because there were people who were the seeds of our understanding and our willingness to carry out God's will for what is right and just and decent and necessary. It leads to material prosperity because parents and farmers and people who have abilities and enterprise, they're going to go out and they're going to work hard so that they can take care of those whom God has entrusted to their care. They're going to do their best to build up homes that will feed their children and schools that will educate them and churches in which they can learn the greatest source of strength is in the Spirit of God. You do believe, don't you, that I don't care what they say. It was those people who built this country. You can go back and look at the colorful robbers and murderers and prostitutes and bars and saloons, and you do understand, don't you, that if that had been the predominant character of our country, it would have come to nothing. Did it usually follow a pattern? It often follows a pattern. The Bible predicts it. Raise up a child in the way that he should go. And when he is old. Did you ever pause over that? Whoa, what is that about? When he is old, I'm raising this kid up now. I need him not to depart from this way so we can have some peace in this house. But that's not what the scripture tells you. The scripture tells you that there might be a little wandering about. Mbta, by the way, a word that we're very fond of in America because it has to do with having the courage to take a chance, take a leap, and so forth and so on. And Mbta is the Latin word that basically might be translated as errant. Errant being in its root one who wanders about, one who strays from the established paths, right? Now, you and I both know that we have many movies and we have many books and we have many speeches in which that particular quality of the people of the United States has been praised to the skies as one of the reasons why free enterprise has worked in America, why we have been able to build our businesses and meet the challenges of our historic wildernesses and frontiers and possibilities, develop those opportunities rather than neglected them. Ambition doesn't appear to be an entirely awful thing. Maybe that's God's way of saying, I didn't sit you in this world so that you could sit down and not give in to the desire to look at all the different ways in which I have manifested myself in this world and in the existing things that you can encounter there. I don't think God minds our wanderings. I don't think he minds our ambition. What he does mind is that we wander in a way that does not respect his provision for our good and that of the creation that he made, at least partly, with us in mind. And America has been about trying to walk that path. The path that is willing to seek out the knowledge of God. And I often wonder, because sometimes we talk about that passage as if it doesn't imply this, but that is what Christ says. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Well, most of the time you don't seek a thing you've already found. You've got to go look for it. You've got to have your eyes open. You've got to have your heart open. You've got to have your will open to the possibilities that God sets before you. You've got to be willing to see and accept the challenge of the task that he has set. I loved what we heard today about that. It's all what it's about. And that is not necessarily the life of sitting back and do it for me, God. No, he doesn't say that. He says, I have set before thee life and death, blessings and curses. Choose. And then you follow the way and you get the blessings. You do by his commands and you get the blessings. You see what I mean? I want you to be up and doing. And that's part of what America's been about. But the reason that it worked for us, more or less, is that we didn't decide, all of us, to go wandering about like Billy the Kid, seeking first the wealth of others. We wandered about seeking first the riches of God, which are stored up in our heart by our willingness to obey him, by our willingness to love him to the point of that obedience. And we are failing now. I think we need to admit it. I don't care what it looks like in the short term. We have set ourselves on a path that must lead to the extinction of our decent way of life. We will momentarily, some of us do better and some of us do worse. But at the end of the day, we have abandoned our commitment to do God's will. And as a result, we have abandoned the very foundation of our rights. For without that commitment, we may have freedom, but we will not have rights. We may have freedom, but we will not have the blessings of liberty. For liberty is freedom rightly used. And there'll be many opportunities in the upcoming day or so to talk a little bit about what that implies. You're going to hear about it, because I think a lot of people who are speaking at this conference and presenting, they, in their different ways, know and understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's nothing new to them. The final part of the task, though, which we haven't been so good at translating as a people so far, and yet in previous times they were better. And this is about something we need to admit. It's one of the reasons why I'm so appalled and actually get angry, especially, by the way, at Black Americans who join these jackals who want to devour the reputation of the founders and who want to act as if we can get on our high horse and be all superior to the founders because Washington owned slavery and Jefferson owned, these people had slavery. Slavery is awful. Oh, excuse me. How do you know that slavery is awful? Well, I know because it says right here that we have these unalienable rights, and liberty is one of those rights. Slavery must be awful. And who wrote those words? The founding generation of America. So they articulated the truths, the self-evident truths, in the light of which their own practices would be condemned. You think they knew that, do you? You think they knew that they had set that wicked way of life on the road to extinction? Because I know they did. I've read some of their letters and other things, and they said it time and time again. They also said that they knew the harm that it did, not just to the slave, but to the character and the heart and the spirit of the people who enslaved them. And that being the case, I find it really incongruous that a generation that is so wholeheartedly committed to the murder of its own offspring that they actually want to make the unwillingness to aid and abet that murder a crime, should dare to get on their high horse and play the judge and jury for the generation that set in place the world's most effective declaration of the decency, of the justice that is owed to all human beings by the will of God, affirmed in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And as we back away from that understanding, we back away from that commitment. And as we back away from that commitment, the meaning of our nation's existence for ourselves, for our posterity, and for the world, it is fading and will soon be gone. For the meaning was not just the result of our own courage and our own will, and certainly not of our own wisdom. I look back at some moments in American history, including the Civil War, and I still think that people ought to get down on their knees and acknowledge that this nation survived as the result of not one, but a whole series of miracles. That it came back together as a nation, not as the result of one, but a whole series of miracles. And the second may have even been harder, because these weren't miracles worked at all the people all at once. They were miracles worked one heart at a time, one commitment at a time, one backing away from a whole lifetime of prejudice and presumption at a time. All done, or much of it done, because they were faced with the articulation that Martin Luther King epitomized, that quoted the words of the Declaration, that wielded as a two-edged sword the authority of God for justice. And I say, as Christian people, don't look somewhere else. I am sick and tired of reading all about how the leftists and the ideologues and the communists and the socialists, they're responsible for all our woes. What they're doing cannot kill America. What we are not doing is killing America. And if we don't wake up and respond to the challenge of God's authority that is right there clear in the Declaration, that is the heart and soul of our true freedom, which is the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, then our nation, already far gone in the loss of that liberty, will finally and irretrievably cast it away. We will cast away their cords from us and break their bonds asunder. But those are the bonds of God's will, the bonds of God's command, the bonds of God's benevolent love for our good as individuals and as a species that account for our existence, that account for our survival, and that have, more than anything else, been responsible for the little moment of greatness that we did in fact enjoy. But frankly, I don't think it's at all what we think. I don't think the greatest moments in American history, the greatest moments in our life as a people, were the moments when we celebrated our victory over our enemies, when we strode the world like a colossus on account of our being the last economy standing and the greatest military power in the world. I think the greatest moment came when, on account of our understanding of what we respected about ourselves and our country, we did not look at the world and say, we have the thunderbolt Napoleon wished for. You shall bow down and do our will. But instead, holding the power that tyrants and would-be despots had only dreamed of, the people of the United States chose to heed the example of Christ and to leave it to him at the hour that God will appoint to judge and doom the wicked. And instead of taking that task upon ourselves, we looked at people and said, let us follow the way of God's peace. Let us understand right according to the rights that he has endowed and the will that he has written upon all of our hearts. This is our way as Americans. We think it is a better way for all humanity. In the moment when we stood in his will and communicated his true heart for his creation, already made manifest in his forgiveness again and again and again for his chosen people, we carried a message of God that, as Kennedy said, can truly change the world. Not because we are great, but because we know that God is greater, and we are determined to live accordingly.